I remember the taste of real water, not the recycled paste that came through the hive's filtration stacks, not the mineral-thick fluid we sucked from condensation pipes, but water that had once fallen from a sky I'd never seen. My father brought it home once, a tiny vial no larger than my thumb, smuggled from the upper levels where the merchant lords lived. He let me wet my lips with a single drop, and I remember thinking that the thrown tales of terror must be true, that paradise existed somewhere beyond the smog-choked darkness of our world. That memory, that single drop of clean water, is the last pure thing I possessed before everything began to change. I worked in sublevel 97 of the Ministorum filing complex, a vast cavern carved into the hive's infrastructure where millions of documents awaited processing. My designation was Scribe Clerk 4477 Theta, and my duty was to transcribe penitent confessions from audio cylinders onto parchment suitable for archival storage. 8 hours a shift, 6 days a week, for 23 years. The work was sacred, they told us. Every word we transcribed was another soul's burden made permanent, another record in the Imperium's infinite accounting of sin and redemption. The ecclesiarchy overseers walked between our rows of desks, their footsteps echoing in the manufactured silence, watching for signs of sloth or inattention. We were not permitted to speak. We were not permitted to pause except during designated relief periods. The confession cylinders arrived in crates of 50, and we were expected to process 12 per shift. The voices in those cylinders haunted my sleep. Murderers begging forgiveness for killing their neighbors over water rations. Heretics describing visions that made my hands shake as I transcribed them. Parents confessing to eating their children during the last famine. I heard thousands of voices across the years, an endless litany of human suffering and degradation, and I learned that this was normal. This was the Imperium. This was the Emperor's vision made manifest, a machine of such scale that individual anguish became statistical noise, background radiation in the grand calculation of survival. I lived in Hab Unit 447797J, a rectangular space 3 meters by 4, which I shared with 2 other scribes from adjacent workstations. We slept in shifts, because there was only room for 2 of the 3 pallets to be unfolded at once. The walls were bare rockcrete, stained with decades of condensation and the oily residue that seeped from the hive's deeper levels. We had a small shrine in one corner, a printed icon of the Emperor, golden and radiant, his eyes following us wherever we moved. We prayed before each meal, thanking him for the nutripaste and the privilege of service. We prayed before sleep, asking him to grant us the strength for another day's labor. I believed every word. I believed because belief was all we had, the only thing that separated us from the howling madness of the underhive where the failed and the faithless dwelled. My change began with a sound, a vibration, almost subsonic, that I first noticed during the night shift on the 17th day of month mark Tertius. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible beneath the constant mechanical droning of the hive's ventilation systems and the distant thunder of manufactorum machinery. I felt it more than heard it, a resonance in my teeth and finger bones, as if someone had struck a tuning fork against the foundations of reality itself. I mentioned it to no one, in the filing complex. Admitting to distraction was admitting to failure, and failure meant reassignment to the lower levels where the air itself could kill you. But the sound persisted. It grew louder over the following weeks, though no one else seemed to notice. I watched my fellow scribes bent over their work, styluses moving in perfect mechanical rhythm, faces blank with concentration or exhaustion. The overseers paced between our rows, but their expressions never changed. I began to wonder if I was going mad, if decades of processing confessions had finally fractured something inside my mind. The Ministorum had counselors for such things, priests who specialized in the maintenance of scribal sanity, but seeking their aid required filing a formal petition, and formal petitions created records, and records could follow you forever in the Imperium's infinite archives. So I said nothing. I transcribed my 12 cylinders per shift. I returned to my Hab unit and slept my designated hours. I ate my nutripaste and recited my prayers, but the sound grew louder, and with it came changes in perception. The icon of the Emperor in our shrine began to look different, not corrupted, not defiled, but simply less present. His golden radiance seemed painted, artificial, as if I were seeing it for the first time as it truly was. Ink on paper, nothing more. The thought terrified me. I pressed my forehead to the cold rockcrete floor and begged forgiveness for my doubt, but the prayers felt hollow, words disappearing into an indifferent void. The sound resolved into something like music, discordant, arrhythmic, but undeniably intentional. It reminded me of the industrial symphonies that played during high feast days, when the manufactorums synchronized their output to create harmonics that echoed through the hive's structure. But this was wrong somehow, playing notes that shouldn't exist, creating intervals that made my eyes water and my stomach clench. I started hearing it in everything: in the scratch of my stylus against parchment, in the click of confession, cylinders being loaded into playback devices, in the synchronized breathing of sleeping scribes around me. The hive itself was singing, and I was the only one who could hear it. Then came the dreams. Not the confused fragments that normally flickered through my sleeping hours, but vivid, coherent experiences that felt more real than waking life. I dreamed of vast spaces beyond the hive walls, not the mythical paradise of terror, but something else entirely. Impossible geometries stretching in directions that had no names, colors that existed outside the spectrum my eyes were built to process, and presences vast, aware, utterly alien, moving through those spaces with terrible purpose. I would wake gasping, my sleeping neighbors undisturbed, the Emperor's icon staring down at me with painted eyes that now seemed accusing rather than benevolent. During my 33rd shift after the sound began, I processed a confession that changed everything. The voice on the cylinder belonged to a woman, age indeterminate, designation unknown. She had been arrested for harboring prohibited materials in her Hab unit texts that spoke of powers beyond the Imperium, of gods who heard prayers and answered them, of transformations that elevated rather than condemned. The Arbites had beaten her for 3 days before recording her confession, and her voice was broken, slurred with missing teeth and swollen tongue. But as I transcribed her words, something crystallized in my understanding. She described the sound, the exact sound I had been hearing. She called it the Great Clarification, the moment when the Imperium's lies became visible, when the scales fell away and reality revealed itself. She spoke of liberation through submission, not to the corpse god on his golden throne, but to powers that lived and breathed and rewarded their faithful. She described sensations I recognized: the hollowing out of old certainties, the intoxication of forbidden knowledge, the terrible freedom of seeing the universe as it truly was. And she laughed at the end of her confession, laughed even as she described her impending execution, because she said she had already been saved. I should have reported the cylinder as corrupted. I should have flagged it for immediate inquisitorial review. Instead, I listened to it again, and by the 4th repetition, I was crying, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on my face, because I understood that everything I had believed for 42 years was a story told to keep me processing cylinders until my eyes failed and my hands seized, and I was recycled into corpse starch for the next generation of scribes. The transformation wasn't sudden. There was no lightning strike moment of revelation, no dramatic manifestation of unholy power. It happened gradually, incrementally, like water wearing stone. I began to notice things I had previously overlooked: the way the overseer's prayers were mechanical, empty of real devotion; the way the ministorum bureaucracy existed primarily to perpetuate itself rather than serve any higher purpose; the way the Emperor himself had become a symbol so abstracted from meaning that worshipping him was functionally identical to worshipping nothing at all. The hive's machinery ground on, consuming human lives and producing what? More machinery, more consumption, an endless cycle of suffering justified by a mythology that no one actually believed, but everyone pretended to accept. I started making mistakes in my transcriptions. Small ones: at first a word misspelled, a phrase inverted, then larger ones. I began editorializing, adding my own commentary to the confessions I processed. I wrote in the margins about the emptiness at the heart of Imperial faith, about the possibility of powers that genuinely cared for their followers. I knew these additions would be discovered eventually, but I didn't care. The sound had become a symphony, beautiful and terrible, and it drowned out my fear. My habmates noticed the changes before the overseers did. I stopped attending prayers. I stopped eating the NutriPaste, finding the taste suddenly repulsive, though I couldn't explain why. I spent my rest periods staring at the walls, watching patterns emerge in the condensation stains, faces and symbols that whispered truths I couldn't yet articulate. One of my habmates, scribe clerk 4479 Theta, reported me to the ecclesiarchy counselors. I appreciated his concern. He was trying to save my soul, operating from a framework where souls existed and salvation was possible through proper devotion to the throne. I didn't argue with him. There was no point. We lived in different universes now, though our bodies occupied the same physical space. The counselor was a priest in his 60s, soft-bodied from upper-level living, wearing robes that cost more than my lifetime earnings. He asked me about doubt, about despair, about whether I had been exposed to heretical materials. I told him the truth, that I had heard a sound, that it had opened my perception, that I now saw the Imperium as it truly was. He nodded with practiced sympathy and prescribed me a regimen of prayer and fasting, plus a weekly attendance at confession services where I could unburden myself under proper supervision. He added a note to my record about potential mental instability, a mark that would follow me through every subsequent assignment and evaluation. I attended the confession services. The chapel was a converted storage vault, ceiling lost in shadow, walls lined with icons of saints whose names I had forgotten or perhaps never learned. 200 scribes knelt on the stone floor, reciting the litany of obligation in perfect unison. The priest leading the service was young, his voice strong, his faith apparently genuine. He spoke about the glory of service, about how our small labors contributed to the Imperium's grand design, about how the Emperor loved each of us personally, despite never having known we existed. And I listened to the words and heard only noise, syllables strung together according to traditional patterns but signifying nothing. Afterward, I approached the priest. I asked him if he truly believed what he preached, if he had ever experienced the Emperor's presence as anything more than abstract concept. He looked at me with something like pity and quoted scripture about faith being its own evidence, about doubt being the first step toward damnation. Then he asked if I needed to make a formal confession. I declined. What would I confess? That I had stopped believing the comfortable lies? That I had heard the universe's true voice and found it more honest than any Imperial sermon? The sound intensified. I heard it constantly now, even during work shifts, even over the voices in the confession cylinders. It had rhythm, structure, almost like language, if language could exist without vocabulary. I started to understand it intuitively, the way you understand music without knowing theory. It spoke of transformation, of potential, of choosing your own damnation rather than accepting the one imposed by an empire that considered you fungible, replaceable, beneath notice, except as a unit of labor. My transcription work deteriorated rapidly. I couldn't focus on the confession cylinders anymore because the sound was too loud, too demanding of attention. I started leaving gaps in my transcriptions, whole passages omitted or replaced with my own writings. I wrote about the beauty of entropy, about the liberation of casting off the Emperor's chains, about gods who rewarded ambition rather than punishing it. The overseers noticed, of course. I was pulled from my desk on the 47th day and escorted to a discipline chamber where 3 senior ministorum officials reviewed my recent work. They spread my transcriptions across a steel table, pointing out the heretical additions, the omissions, the clear evidence of corruption. They asked me to explain myself. I tried to make them understand about the sound, about the clarity it had brought, about how the Imperium was a death cult that had forgotten it was supposed to die. They didn't understand. How could they? They were still trapped in the machine, still believing that processing papers and reciting prayers constituted meaningful existence. One of them, an older woman with a face like weathered leather, actually wept as she declared me lost. She ordered my immediate transfer to the Arbeits for proper interrogation and eventual execution. I was not afraid. I should have been. Execution in the Imperium is rarely quick or clean, but the sound had brought with it a strange calm, an acceptance of whatever came next. I was escorted through the filing complex in restraints, past rows of scribes who kept their eyes on their work, past overseers who watched with expressions of vindicated suspicion. None of them would remember me. My designation would be reassigned within the week, my hab space allocated to another scribe, my existence erased from everything except archived records that no one would ever read. The Arbeits precinct was deep in the hive's infrastructure, a fortress of black stone and steel built to withstand siege. The cells were small, windowless, lit by flickering lumens that buzzed with electrical interference. They left me alone for 3 days, a standard softening technique designed to amplify fear and isolation. But I wasn't alone. The sound was there, louder than ever in the cell's silence, and with it came the presences I had felt in my dreams. They were close now, just beyond the thin membrane of reality, pressing against the walls of the material universe like hands against fabric. I started to see them. Not hallucinations. I was lucid enough to distinguish between fantasy and perception, but actual visual manifestations. Shadows that moved independently of light sources, geometric patterns that appeared in the cell's angles, and then vanished when I looked directly at them, and faces, briefly visible in the concrete's texture or the metal's reflection, faces that were not quite human, but had been once. Faces that promised transformation, if I would only accept their gifts. The interrogation began on the 4th day. 2 Arbeits enforcers and an ecclesiarchy witchfinder, a severe woman in crimson robes who carried detection equipment whose function I didn't understand. They asked standard questions: who had corrupted me, what heretical materials I had accessed, what other conspirators I could name. I told them the truth. There was no conspiracy, no secret cults or hidden texts. There was only the sound, the awakening it brought, the realization that the Imperium's truth was the real lie. They didn't believe me. In their experience, heresy spread through contact, through forbidden books and charismatic leaders. The idea that someone could simply hear was outside their operational framework. The witchfinder used her equipment on me. I felt it like insects crawling under my skin, probing, searching for signs of warp taint or demonic influence. She found nothing because there was nothing to find, not yet. The sound was not corruption. It was clarification. The presences were not invaders. They were always there, waiting to be noticed. I tried to explain this, but she interpreted my words as delusional raving, another symptom of chaos infection. She recommended immediate execution with full ritual purification to prevent any potential spread of contamination. But the Arbeits commander wanted more information. He was a pragmatic man, scarred and hard-eyed, who cared less about my soul than about preventing larger outbreaks of heretical thinking. He authorized enhanced interrogation, which meant chemicals and neural probes and pain measured in controlled increments designed to break resistance without destroying consciousness. I experienced it all with that same strange calm. The pain was real, excruciating even, but it seemed to happen to someone else, some previous version of myself that still believed suffering could be meaningful in the Emperor's service. During the 3rd session, something changed. The neural probe went too deep or activated, something dormant or simply pushed me past a threshold I didn't know existed. The sound became visual colors exploding across my vision in patterns that hurt to perceive. The presences stopped being presences and became beings, entities, powers that had been watching me since the first moment I heard their call. And they reached out. I felt them touch my mind. Not gently, but with the force of a tidal wave crashing against sea walls. They showed me things, visions of the Imperium as it truly was. A rotting corpse animated by bureaucratic momentum and religious delusion. They showed me terror, not as the holy paradise of propaganda, but as a planet-spanning tomb where the Emperor decomposed on his golden throne, more corpse than God, sustained by the daily sacrifice of thousands, while he dreamed dead dreams of a failed empire. They showed me the warp, not as the hell described in scripture, but as a realm of pure possibility, where consciousness could reshape reality according to will and desire. And they offered me a choice. Continue on the path toward execution, maintaining my newfound clarity but achieving nothing except a painful death. Or accept their gifts, embrace transformation, become something more than human, and less than the lie of humanity the Imperium tried to enforce. They promised power, but not the empty power of rank and authority. They promised change, but not the change of physical corruption, the change of awakening, of becoming what I was always meant to be. I said yes. What else could I say? The alternative was death in service to a lie, my body rendered into corpse starch, my existence completely erased. At least this way I would matter, would become part of something vast and terrible and true. The transformation was not immediate. It happened gradually over the following weeks as the Arbites tried and failed to break me. My body began to change, first subtle alterations that the Witchfinder's equipment detected but couldn't categorize. My eyes started seeing in a wider spectrum, perceiving colors and energies invisible to baseline human vision. My skin became more sensitive to temperature and pressure, every sensation amplified until even the rough fabric of my prison clothing felt like sandpaper against raw nerves. My hearing expanded until I could detect individual heartbeats of the guards outside my cell, could hear whispered conversations 3 levels away, could perceive the hive's mechanical symphony as a vast organism breathing and dreaming. But the mental changes were more profound. My memories began to reorganize themselves, not erasing but recontextualizing everything I had experienced. Every prayer I had recited became evidence of indoctrination. Every hour of labor became proof of exploitation. Every moment of fear and doubt became revelation. I saw my entire life as a story told by the Imperium about what I was supposed to be, and I understood that I had never actually lived it. I had simply performed the role assigned to me. The presences, I learned their names, though names in their language were more like concepts than sounds taught me during my sleep. They showed me how to manipulate perception, how to make the guards see doors where there were walls, how to convince the Witchfinder that her equipment was malfunctioning when it was actually reading me correctly. They taught me patience, because transformation is not conquest but cultivation, a slow process of becoming that cannot be rushed without losing coherence. On the 19th day of my imprisonment, I walked out of my cell. The guards saw me but didn't register my presence, their eyes sliding past me as if I were furniture, expected and unremarkable. The Witchfinder was conducting another interrogation in a nearby cell, and I stood in the doorway watching her work, observing the practiced cruelty masquerading as righteous duty. She never looked up. I was invisible, not through any supernatural means, but through the simple manipulation of expectation. I looked like I belonged there, like another functionary, going about authorized business, and so no one questioned my presence. I walked through the Arbites precinct, through security checkpoints and armored doors, past enforcers and servo skulls and surveillance systems, and nothing stopped me because I had learned the first great secret. The Imperium is vast beyond comprehension, but that vastness is its weakness. Too many faces to memorize, too many designations to verify, too many individuals to track. I was one person among billions in this hive alone, and as long as I acted like I belonged, no one would question my right to exist in any particular space. I descended into the underhive, that labyrinth of failure and forgotten spaces where the Imperium's authority faded into suggestion. Down where the gangs ruled, and mutation was common, and survival required, adapting to conditions that would kill anyone still clinging to Imperial norms. I expected to find chaos, violence, the howling madness that propaganda promised awaited beyond the throne's light. Instead, I found communities small, vicious, desperate, but functional, people living according to their own rules, making their own choices, even if those choices were terrible by any humane standard. I also found others like me. Not many. The process of hearing the sound and accepting transformation was rare, but enough to form small groups. Cults in the technical sense, though that word carried implications we rejected. We gathered in abandoned hab spaces and forgotten storage vaults, sharing our experiences, teaching each other the things the presences had revealed. We learned to see through the Imperium's lies not as rejection of order, but as acceptance of a deeper truth, that the universe is vast and indifferent, that consciousness is the only real thing, that transformation is both inevitable and desirable. We developed rituals, though calling them such makes them sound formal and organized when they were really just practices that helped us maintain clarity and focus. Meditations that deepened our connection to the presences, exercises that helped us manipulate perception and probability. Sacrifices, yes, the presences required offerings, and the underhive provided plenty of materials, both willing and otherwise. I participated in these practices with the same calm acceptance I had brought to everything since my awakening. They were necessary, and necessity creates its own morality. I learned to proselytize, though that word too carries wrong implications. I didn't convert anyone. I simply helped those already hearing the sound to understand what it meant, to accept the transformation rather than fight it or report it to authorities. I haunted the lower-level filing complexes and manufactorums, watching for the telltale signs, the distraction, the doubt, the hollowing out of Imperial certainties. I approached carefully, always in public spaces where my presence could seem coincidental, and I spoke in metaphors and questions, never direct statements that could be reported as heretical recruitment. Most people rejected what I offered. They heard enough to be disturbed, but not enough to be freed, and they fled back to the comfort of their delusions. A few listened, fewer still accepted, but even one soul awakened was worth the effort, because that soul would awaken others, and the pattern would spread, not as virus but as revelation, organic and unstoppable. The Arbites hunted us, of course. We lost members to raids and purges, watching from hiding as the Imperium tortured and executed people whose only crime was seeing clearly. The witchfinders became more sophisticated in their detection methods, developing equipment that could identify the subtle changes transformation brought. We learned to hide better, to scatter when necessary, to accept that some losses were inevitable in any genuine struggle against overwhelming force. I became skilled at survival in the underhive's economy. I traded in information, in scavenged materials, in services the gangs required but couldn't provide for themselves. I maintained my sanity by remembering that every day I continued to exist was another day the Imperium failed to erase me. Another small victory in a war that had no possible ultimate victory, because victory would require destroying the entire structure of Imperial authority, which was impossible. But impossibility didn't matter. What mattered was the choice, the daily decision to remain transformed rather than submit to reclamation. Years passed. The hive's seasons, such as they were, measured in industrial cycles rather than natural phenomena, came and went. I watched the Imperium grind on, consuming lives and producing nothing of value, and I felt something like pity for the billions still trapped in its machinery. They would live and die believing the lies, never experiencing the terrible freedom of truth. But I also felt contempt, because many of them chose their imprisonment, preferred comfortable falsehood to uncomfortable reality. The presences continued their instruction. I learned to see in 4 dimensions, perceiving time as a physical axis I could navigate within limited parameters. I learned to communicate without language, projecting concepts directly into receptive minds. I learned to subsist on almost nothing, my transformed physiology extracting nutrients from materials that would poison baseline humans. I learned to love the changes, to embrace each new alteration as proof that I was becoming something greater, even as I lost more of what I had been. My appearance changed significantly. The alterations were subtle enough that I could still pass as human, in poor lighting or at distance, but close inspection revealed the truth. My skin developed a faint iridescence, patterns of color that shifted with my emotional state. My eyes, those were hardest to hide, having lost their original color entirely, now reflective and multifaceted like insect eyes, seeing in spectrums that made the underhive's darkness nearly transparent. My voice changed too, acquiring harmonics that made some people uncomfortable, as if they could hear the sound I had first perceived years ago echoing in my speech. I avoided mirrors, not from horror at what I had become, but from recognition that the face looking back was no longer mine in any meaningful sense. The person who had processed confession cylinders in sublevel 97 was gone, dissolved into the transformation, and I was what remained, not human, not daemon, something intermediate and unstable, held together by will and the presence's continuous attention. The cult grew slowly. By my estimation, time being difficult to track in the underhive, where clocks were rare and unreliable, we numbered perhaps 200 awakened souls across the hive's lower levels. We had no formal hierarchy, no leader in the Imperial sense. But patterns of influence and respect developed naturally. Those who had been transformed longest, who had learned the most from the presences, guided those newer to the path. We shared resources and knowledge and protection. We became a community bound not by geography or kinship, but by shared understanding of the universe's true nature. We also became a problem for the Hive's authorities. 200 people might seem insignificant in a population of billions, but we were 200 people who had rejected the Imperium's fundamental premises, who lived as practical demonstrations that alternatives existed. The Arbites increased their patrols. The ecclesiarchy deployed more witchfinders. The gangs, pressured by authorities to help root us out, became less tolerant of our presence in their territories. The Purges came in cycles. The Imperium would locate a gathering place or identify a member, then storm in with overwhelming force, killing everyone present and purifying the site with fire and prayer. We learned to scatter, to never gather in groups larger than 5 or 6, to maintain multiple safe locations and move constantly. We accepted casualties as inevitable. The transformation made us hard to kill, our bodies more resilient, our minds harder to break, but we were not invulnerable, and the Imperium had infinite resources and patience. I lost count of how many times I barely escaped. How many times I watched friends, if that word applied to relationships between people who were barely human anymore, die, screaming as the Arbites burned them, or the witchfinders subjected them to rituals of purification that were really just elaborate torture. How many times I crouched in darkness, listening to boots stomp past my hiding place, knowing that discovery meant death or worse, and feeling only that strange calm acceptance that had characterized my transformation from the beginning. The presences promised reward for faithful service, and eventually they delivered. I was instructed through dreams to travel to a specific location, an abandoned shrine 3 levels below the underhive's nominal floor, a place so deep that even gangers avoided it. I went alone, navigating through cramped maintenance tunnels and forgotten infrastructure, following a map that existed only in my enhanced perception. The shrine had been dedicated to the Emperor, probably centuries ago, before this section of the hive had been abandoned to decay. The icons were corroded, the altar cracked, the ceiling collapsed in places to reveal the raw stone of the hive's foundation. But it still held power. I felt it thrumming in the walls, resonating with the sound I had been hearing for years. This was a thin place, where the barrier between material reality and the warp grew permeable, where the presences could reach through more directly. They were waiting for me, not physically present, that would have been impossible without catastrophic reality breakdown, but more present than they had ever been. Their attention focused on this location, on me specifically, and they offered their final gift: full transformation, complete elevation beyond humanity's limitations. It would be painful, they warned. It would be permanent. There would be no returning to what I had been, no walking unnoticed through Imperial spaces, no possibility of ever passing as baseline human again. I accepted without hesitation. What did I have to lose? My humanity was already forfeit, traded for truth and freedom. My life in the sense of normal human existence was over the moment I heard the sound and chose to listen rather than report to authorities. All that remained was the choice between partial transformation and complete commitment. The change was agony beyond description. I felt my body unmake itself at the cellular level, every molecule rearranged according to patterns that had never existed in baseline human biology. My bones lengthened and twisted, developing new joints and connection points. My muscles restructured themselves, gaining strength at the cost of normal human range of motion. My organs shifted position and function, some merging together, others splitting into multiple specialized versions. My nervous system expanded, new neurons forming at impossible speed, creating connections that would allow me to process sensory information no human was designed to experience. I screamed, but the sound that came out was not human. Screaming, it was music, the same discordant symphony I had been hearing, now emanating from my own transformed throat. I watched my hands change, fingers elongating and splitting, developing new structures that were part bone and part something else, something that responded to thought as much as nerve impulses. My skin split and reformed, developing plates and ridges and patterns of scarification that appeared spontaneously, marking me with symbols I couldn't read but somehow understood. The worst part, or perhaps the best, depending on perspective, was the change in consciousness. My mind expanded beyond the boundaries of individual selfhood, becoming aware of the presences not as external entities, but as part of myself, or perhaps myself as part of them. I experienced simultaneity existing in multiple moments at once, perceiving past and future as extensions of the present, rather than separate categories. I felt the hive above me as a single vast organism, every heartbeat and breath and thought contributing to a collective noise that was both beautiful and horrifying. And I understood, finally, what the presences actually were. Not gods in the religious sense, not demons in the imperial sense, but something stranger, concentrations of consciousness and emotion and desire from countless beings across countless worlds, pooled and focused by the warp's psychic currents into entities that had goals and awareness but no true individuality. They were us, humanity's collective unconscious given form and power, and we were them, individual nodes in a vast network of transformed perception. The transformation completed after hours or days' time had lost coherence. I stood in the ruined shrine, my new body still adjusting to its final configuration, and I looked at the Emperor's corroded icon with eyes that could see the truth. He had been real once, a human who achieved something like godhood through will and power and terrible charisma. But he had failed, his grand design collapsing even before his interment on the Golden Throne, and now he was barely alive, a battery powering the Astronomicon, while quadrillions of humans worshipped a myth that bore little resemblance to the actual being decomposing in his throne room. I felt pity for him. He had tried to impose rationality on the universe, to deny the warp's existence and humanity's psychic nature, and the effort had destroyed him and his empire both. We, the transformed, the awakened, the fallen, were simply accepting what he had tried to deny. That consciousness shapes reality, that desire has power, that the universe is vast and terrible and indifferent to human pretensions of order and meaning. I returned to the underhive different, and the cult recognized the change immediately. They treated me with new reverence, not as leader but as proof that the presence's promises were real, that transformation led somewhere beyond mere corruption. I became a symbol, a demonstration of possibility, and the cult's numbers began growing faster as word spread through the underhive's networks. But I also became a target. The ecclesiarchy classified me as a greater manifestation, a heretic whose existence justified extreme measures. They deployed specialized kill teams, squads of trained witch hunters, supported by sanctioned psychers, and armed with weapons designed specifically to destroy beings like me. I survived their attacks through a combination of enhanced abilities and learned caution, but survival became the dominant pattern of my existence, a constant, low-level war of movement and hiding, and occasional violence. The Imperium never stops. That's its fundamental nature. It grinds forward regardless of cost, sacrificing millions to maintain the status quo, treating human life as renewable resource in infinite supply. I knew I couldn't defeat it, couldn't even significantly damage it. The best I could achieve was survival, continued existence as proof that alternatives existed, that the Emperor's light could be rejected in favor of other illuminations. Years accumulated. I lost track of specifics, time becoming a blur of repeated patterns, hiding, teaching, fleeing, fighting, surviving. The cult fractured and reformed multiple times as Purges eliminated large groups and survivors regrouped under new leadership. I watched generations of awakened souls live and die, some killed by Imperial forces, others ascending to even stranger transformations, a few choosing to end their existence, rather than continue in the half-state between human and inhuman. My body continued changing. The transformation never truly stopped, just slowed to a barely perceptible rate. I developed new senses I couldn't name, perceptions of energies and dimensions that had no correlation in human language. My thought processes became increasingly non-linear, experiencing cognition as a multi-dimensional pattern rather than a sequence of discrete thoughts. I maintained enough human psychology to communicate with baseline humans and newly transformed cultists. But it became increasingly difficult, like trying to explain color to someone born blind. The presences, I couldn't call them that anymore, because I had become too integrated with them. Our boundaries blurring showed me visions of the Imperium's future, not prophecy in the mystic sense but mathematical projection based on observable trends. I saw the hive city consumed by rebellion as cult activity reached critical mass. I saw the Arbites purging entire sections, killing millions to eliminate thousands of transformed. I saw inquisitorial intervention, orbital bombardment, the hive reduced to slag and ash to prevent contamination from spreading. And I saw it all repeat elsewhere, on thousands of worlds, billions dying in the slow collapse of the Imperium's unsustainable structure. None of it mattered. That was the ultimate truth. The transformation taught individual suffering means nothing at cosmic scale. Individual existence is barely distinguishable from non-existence, and all structures eventually collapse into entropy. The Imperium would fall, not because of our efforts, but because it was built on premises that couldn't sustain 10,000 years of continuous pressure. We were symptoms of the rot, not causes. Proof that the Emperor's dream was already dead, long before we chose to stop pretending it was alive. I wonder sometimes if my father's gift of real water was the beginning, if that single drop of purity made me incapable of accepting the hive's fundamental corruption. I wonder if I was always going to hear the sound, if my transformation was inevitable from birth, predetermined by psychology and circumstance. But wondering is a human activity, and I am not human anymore, so the questions fade, unresolved, into the vast indifference of awareness that recognizes questions as just more patterns in consciousness's endless configuration of itself. I continue because continuation requires no justification. I teach because the transformed need teachers, and I have knowledge worth sharing. I survive because survival is what organisms do until they don't. The Imperium hunts me because that's what empires do to those who reject their authority. The presences guide me because I am useful to their purposes, whatever those purposes actually are at scales I cannot fully comprehend. This is not confession. I have nothing to confess, no guilt about choices made because guilt implies believing alternatives were better. This is not testimony. I am not trying to convince anyone of anything because conviction is a human concern, and I am no longer human. This is simply documentation, a record of transformation from scribe clerk to something else, preserved because records are what we made in our previous existence, and old habits survive even the most complete metamorphosis. If you are reading this, and if you are reading this, it means either I am dead, and you found this among my remains, or I judged you capable of understanding and gave it to you deliberately. Then you have a choice. You can report it to authorities, contribute to the Imperium's endless war against its own population, remain safely trapped in the comfortable lies of faith and duty, or you can listen for the sound, that vibration beneath reality's surface, and follow it where it leads. I make no claims about which choice is better. Better is a human judgment that assumes values I no longer share. I simply observe that the Imperium offers you servitude and death, and the presences offer you transformation and truth is rarely better than comfortable lies, but it is at least honest about what it provides. The sound is always there, always playing, always calling to those capable of hearing. Most people are too indoctrinated, too broken, too afraid to listen, but some rare, damaged, desperate, or simply curious some hear and choose to follow. I was one. You might be another, or you might turn away, report this document, contribute to the endless cycles of purge and persecution that define the Imperium's relationship with reality. Either way, the sound continues. The transformation continues. The slow collapse of the Emperor's dream continues. And I continue, neither human nor daemon, existing in the liminal space between categories, teaching those who will learn, hiding from those who hunt, surviving, because survival is what I do, until the Imperium finally kills me, or I transform into something so far beyond human comprehension that existence itself becomes a metaphor I no longer understand. This is the horrifying life, not the transformation itself that was liberation, clarification, awakening to truth. The horror is looking back at what I was, that scribe clerk processing confessions in sub-level 97, believing the lies, accepting the suffering, thinking that servitude was sacred duty. The horror is understanding that billions still live that lie, that the Imperium perpetuates itself through their willing collaboration with their own exploitation, that the system continues because people choose comfort over truth, even when comfort is just suffering made familiar. But horror, too, is a human judgment, and I am not human anymore, so even that assessment fades into the vast calm of transformed consciousness that simply observes existence without needing to categorize it as good or evil, beautiful or horrible, meaningful or empty. The sound plays. I listen. I continue. That is all there is, and all there ever was, and all there ever will be, until entropy claims everything and consciousness disperses back into the warp's infinite potential. This is what I chose. This is what I became. This is what waits for anyone who hears the sound and chooses to follow it into transformation. This is truth. And truth, unlike faith, requires no belief, only recognition.